And when we talk about training perceptual cognitive skills in sports, we're really talking about two categories. One category is those incredibly ballistic reactive skills, such as hitting a pitched baseball or softball, return of serve in tennis, goalie play in soccer or hockey. And when we talk, we've also got another category, which is more like open play in team sports. So that's ball distribution, the pass, dribble, shoot decision in soccer or basketball. Now, we're going to cover both of these, but we're going to start with those ballistic type of reactions because that's where most of the research has been done. And not that it's necessarily more important, but it's just so fascinating because it's such an extraordinary and really impossible human type of performance, time frames that just challenge simple human reaction time, less than half a second, people making elaborate decisions and actions, while the experts seem to have all the time in the world. And one of the things that we really learn from that is that it's not a vision thing. It is, if we look at the sport of baseball, a baseball vision thing. What can the hitter gain from that pitcher's motion, the release of the pitch, maybe the exertion on it, the immediate ball flight, 150 milliseconds, about 20 feet of ball flight out of hand. Maybe there's a touch of follow through that the expert picks up. They probably won't report on that. And this is where the science is not really helping us that much. We've got an idea of when people are looking, especially with the occlusion paradigm I'll introduce, and where they're looking with the eye tracking paradigm. We know much less about what they're seeing and how they process that into action. You've got to wonder about where this fellow's looking. He's throwing essentially a rock at you at 90 plus miles an hour. You'd hope that he's looking at you. He's looking at the same window that the hitter is looking at. A window in which this pitcher, who threw a no-hitter against the Yankees 2 or 3 years ago with his two-pitch combination of a fastball that starts out in that window and ends up at your waist, and a split-finger fastball that starts out in the same window and ends up at your ankles. Make you look like a fool, boy, as Bruce Springsteen said. So how do we train something like that? Well, you know, one approach is kind of a standard visual skills. Aerobics, Dr. Bill Harrison had a lot of success with major league players, in particular George Brett in the 70s on that. When we combine that with eye tracking, we really get to some special places. And, you know, we can look at apps to recognize spin, and yet what people really see is not so much seeing the spin, seeing the seams as seeing cues. For instance, the legendary hole in the slider, which really you have to think of like a bowling ball, a well-thrown bowling ball, and one of those ones that's got the fancy kind of colorations in it, not a black one, you know. So you can see the spin, and you can see that it's spinning sideways while it goes straight down the alley until the speed is scrubbed off enough that the friction takes over, and that ball dives into the pocket, exploding the pins, and that's a slider. We've got more general type of training like multiple object tracking, here NeuroTracker, Dynavision, some of these sort of things, sometimes physically on a board. Many of you certainly would be familiar with these. Nike was into that with their Sensory Station and their goggles, their strobe goggles. Those have since been taken over by a company called Synaptech. We've also got people working from the neuroscience end, you know, with EEG, trying to locate that moment of pitch decision, swing, no swing. First, a company called NeuroScout that worked on a proprietary basis with the Red Sox years back, and now this is a company called DeServo, in which they're basically animating the pitch coming in and trying to not only train but measure EEG, the effect of that. Now, here's the technology that I've worked with and that sports science has worked with for about 40 years, since the early 80s. That is the video occlusion, temporal occlusion. We're cutting something off in time. This is my laboratory from 2000. So for some of the younger folks in the audience, that's what we call rear projection television, fortunately obsolete. And up there on the top, some of you may even recognize what used to be the go-to format of the VHS tape. So thank goodness we don't have to do that anymore. So here's a video, and you'll see the batter reacting to the occluded pitches, meaning cut off in time. In fact, this is the one right at release. So this is the end of a training round. He's reading those pitches, the type of pitch out of hand. But now watch.
Fastball, split. A curve, split. Fastball, right? Split, good. Slip, chip, very good. Fastball, yes.
So there you see the magic happen. We threw in that split finger fastball, the first one I talked about with the Mariner who threw the no-hitter. And it took him it really threw him off. You see him physically resetting, all but stepping out of his seat and knocking imaginary dirt out of his cleats before stepping back in and locking back in and recognizing those pitches. So that's the video occlusion method. Now, to turn this into something that's actually of use to coaches and to AASP practitioners, it has to be reduced to in this case, an app on an iPad, in which case you're guessing the type of pitch and also whether it's ball or strike, and then getting a feedback on that. So it's repetition, instant feedback, and progressive difficulty. So here you see the pitch being guessed, and the green means it was a correct guess. Now here we see an incorrect guess, and so the user now will seek a replay on that and see that this is the pitch that came in looking like a fastball, but is a very wicked cutter. You're going to hit that one off your shins if you would go with that. And so that's the reduction of the scientific method of video occlusion. So it's not just the findings of that research, but it's also the methods used within that. Then when we talk about really turning this into a viable training method, it's not just the app, it's not just the technology. We're going to have a test retest program, and we've got a certified test that several hundred minor league hitters have taken. You've got the drills I showed you, and then you've got transfer appropriate drills in the batting cage, and here a batter hitting what we call video cued tee work. So you see him lining up there and needing to make a decision in regular time. So now look at this one. He didn't get that one well. One word of coaching, a slight adjustment in his self-feedback on that. I love that moment you just saw there, because that's really advanced coaching. That's all this hitter needs, and because the tape just keeps rolling, and we can see a whole program at work then. We also see that starts very much coming into the realm of simulation, a simulator, and that's something that has come into baseball, and it's not really a new thing. On the left, you see the pro batter, which is an analog simulator. There's a pitching machine behind that pro batter screen that hurls a ball out at 90 miles an hour through a doggy door, and the hitter hits against it. So we've got kind of a digital version of the same thing. Now this is a cave setup. This is life size. That's a wall there. This is something you're standing in against a real pitcher. And so this is kind of the high end of now VR, but we've had these type of simulators around for some years. That is the cave. That company, though, has more recently been purchased in the last couple of years by Dan O'Dowd, who's a former general manager of the Colorado Rockies, and it's run by his son, Chris. And they have really reformulated this from that kind of experiential. Here's the experience of hitting off of a major league pitcher. And they've really reformulated it as a practice tool. So here's a major league hitting coach of the Minnesota Twins getting his first experience with this VR system as you get your first look at it. You can see in the monitor what he's seeing in his goggles. And you can see that it's not that realistic representation of the entire performance of hitting. In fact, he's not really hitting at all. I mean, he's getting himself in the stance, but he's not swinging a bat. You see over by the monitor that there is a bat, and you can have a mode where you swing at that, but he's just using a controller for input. And these are things we're going to talk about in just a little bit, because those are really the important aspects of looking at VR and simulation. You'll also notice that there's a tripod there. There's another one on the other side, and on the top of those are sensors that track where the head-mounted display is in space, and that's what allows him to have that interactivity with it. Now, I do want to note before we go on to look at some of the team things that it's not just baseball. We're talking a lot about baseball, but especially since it's Aussie research, we'll give a nod to something like to serve recognition rather than pitch recognition, with still the same sort of approach. That is this video occlusion approach, in which you've got repetition, immediate feedback, and progressive difficulty, and different research bed there. See, we should have read that one. We should have read kick. Now look, you can see it. Look at his deep knee bend. We should have read kick coming out of hand on that one. Now let's go to the team one. And this is where we say, okay, we're going to have that immersive experience. Now we want to understand that what we're going to look at here is not true VR, which would be an animated signal, an animated display in an immersive environment, so that as you act with it, it is going to react to you. You act and the system reacts to you. This is 360-degree video. We'll see the camera in just a second. This is 360-degree video, so it is read only, let's call it. Very immersive in that, and you can look to the left and you can look to the right as you are wearing this. But if you hit the puck with your stick, that's not going to be shown in this. Again, it's what we might consider read only. Now we have just a few moments of this, very active and engaging right around the net once the puck drops. But this is what we actually have. We have these cameras on top of the helmets, not yet used in games, but used in a practice situation. So this is more like what you're really getting out of something like that. You are getting a first-person point of view. This is great in times like this when you can't get on the ice with your teammates. Now look at here. He was looking down at the puck. So I'm going to freeze frame it on this. I'm going to stay on this frame for a little while because it's probably the least exciting frame in the whole clip. And what we importantly want to be aware of as we look at VR and immersive simulation here is we don't want to see it as something that it's not and grow it into something that we think it should be. And at the same time, we want to see and value what it is. So in the sport of American football, for instance, several years ago, about 5 years ago, a company called Striver started to make one that was for football, and it was the same 360 video, and a quarterback could do the skelly or 7-on-7 where they don't have pass rushers, but they have to pick the open receiver. And any number of NFL teams and Division I football teams paid upwards of $250,000 for this system, and the press covered it, gushing a lot about how they could the quarterback could play the Cowboys before you played the Cowboys, and that wasn't true then. What the quarterback could do was do a 7-on-7, just the receivers against the DBs drill. And if your third string quarterback, who never gets on the field during game week, can do that and be more ready to go into the game when the situation arises, that is worth $250,000 to that team. So let's not get into VR and building it into something that it's not. Like that first part that we saw, where was the camera on that, where we had the game action? It was on the referee. You saw the referee drop the ball, and that would be an interesting place to put the camera. Here on this shot that we just saw, right before I froze it here, you saw the guy looking down at the puck on his stick. Now, this is the kind of thing where a coach looking at that monitor that's showing what the player is seeing is saying, son, you got to be looking down the ice. and actually seeing where he's looking. You could do eye tracking or whatever, but you can actually see that and say, you got to be looking down the ice there. So let's not overestimate what that tool is, but on the other hand, let's appreciate for exactly what it is. And as far as a theoretical foundation for what we're looking at here, this is hot off the press. It's read, it's so hot off the press. Skill acquisition in sport, research theory and practice. And I would point you especially to Rob Gray's chapter on sports training technologies, achieving and assessing transfer. Rob is at Arizona State University. He has done work in simulator type training in vehicles as well as in sports, including baseball. And he also does this absolutely terrific podcast, the Perception and Action podcast. You'll just have to remember that one. Rob Gray, Perception Action podcast, reaching out to coaches with the science of it on a very regular basis, not watering it down, but making it usable. And what he's really looking at are the dimensions of fidelity in a simulation. So the first one we think of is physical fidelity. That is, does it look like the simulation? Does it look like the real experience? And very unfortunately, and at great cost, the simulator industry through the years, the decades even, has focused on simulator-based training almost entirely from the direction of physical fidelity, driven by the engineering challenge of making it as realistic possible with the assumption that more real equals more learning, and there's very little theory to support that. What's more important is the functional fidelity, especially if we're looking at pitch recognition, something like that. We are getting inside the mechanism. 7 times 6 has to equal 42. It can't be 7 times 6 equal 42 except when it's 44 or when it's 46. I mean, we need to have functional fidelity within that. But we also want to consider the psychological fidelity. And this is where you can get a payoff sometimes for some of these more immersive type of simulations. I remember, if you recall, the Miracle on the Hudson, right? And Captain Sullenberger put that fully loaded aircraft down on the Hudson River after taking a bird hit that took out all of his engines, and he did the round of the talk shows afterwards. I remember on one of them in particular, they were talking about simulator training, and he said he'd literally done hundreds of hours of simulator training, and the host said, "Oh, okay, so you've practiced, landing an aircraft on the water." Sully said, "No, I've never practiced a bird strike or an all-engine loss, and certainly not a water landing with a full aircraft." And the host seemed to feel like, okay, well then what was the use of those simulator hours? And he said, what I practiced was controlling my heartbeat, communicating with my first mate and my navigator, working down the checklist, knowing when to stay on list and when to go off list. That's what I was practicing. So there is something to be said for psychological fidelity within that. As indicated in Rob's title, what we're really looking at is transfer. That's what's important to you. What's the transfer of training? So there's 3 levels that Rob talks about in that. Near transfer. Now, I mentioned that we had a video occlusion test that we gave to minor league hitters. And so if they do that, they do the training or do some other type of training, and we see an improvement on that test, that is near transfer. Then there's moderate transfer, in which you're transferring from the mediated environment to some sort of in situ. In this case, some sort of batting practice, some sort of purposeful batting practice. And then, of course, the gold standard of far transfer, where you're affecting performance. And this is what everybody wants to know. They're going to challenge any technique, any technology with, okay, show me the evidence that improves performance. And what I'm going to maintain is that's the wrong question. That's not what we need to be asking. We can see evidence of performance. The sports scientists produce evidence that this or that technique it shows evidence of being effective within a controlled environment. But if we try to look for a great deal of control and placebo groups in an actual situated experimental type application, we're just not going to find it. We're not going to find statistically significant within that. We might need to go to more of a mixed methods. I might refer you to a study that I did that was over 3 years at a college. It's in Frontiers in Psychology. And those are the things we're looking at, as a combination of case study and available statistics, and we're starting to build that up. But the prove it question is the wrong question. We need to trust the sports scientists and the peer review process to the point of saying, hey, these are legitimate methods, and then we need to put them in use. You need to put them in use. And that's when we can focus not on the prove it question, but the improve it question. What are the conditions around successful use of this technology? Is it for initial learning? Is it for late stage learning? Is it for off-season learning? Is it to be done in season? That's when we're asking the right kind of questions. So let me put on that instructional technology professor's hat again and go through just a couple of the aspects of simulator fidelity, because it is so easy to just be kind of gripped with that more real equals more learning idea. A big part of it is the display. You would choose between photorealistic, and that 360 video is photorealistic versus animated. Why would you choose one or the other? And as the master craftsman, that's your job to start picking out what are these tools best for. So photorealistic is really great for making those perceptual cognitive type judgments, but if you want to match them with an action and see the result of the action, then you're going to have to go to an animated realm. Input can be natural or artificial. When we looked at the baseball WinR VR simulator, you saw that there was a bat there. So that would be natural input. But you saw what the coach was using was a handheld device, which was an artificial input. And then you're looking at feedback as being natural or artificial again, and immediate or delayed. And those don't necessarily need to go together. If we're in the flight simulator and you've taken off from island A and you've now gone up and circled above a storm so long that you're now too low on fuel to make island B, natural feedback is not going to say beep, beep, beep. You don't have enough fuel. It's going to let you fly on towards island B until you fly into the ocean 2 miles from island B. That's natural and delayed feedback. So again, what is the stage of learning? Is this a final stage where we're certifying a pilot to be ready to take up an airplane with several hundred passengers? And you do understand, folks, I hope that there are, back when we used to fly airplanes, thousands of flights in which an experienced pilot goes up for the first time in that particular aircraft, flying it for the first time with a full load of passengers. All the training before that was on simulator, just for a little comfort level on that. We also want to consider the use in terms of skill acquisition or performance support. So one of the real few takeaways that I would hope that you would have here would be this notion of skill acquisition versus performance support. Because in the skill acquisition phase, we're trying to build a generalizable skill. So if that skill is pitch recognition, we want enough models of different types of pitchers and pitches so that we build a generalizable model that when we step in against a pitcher we've never seen before, we can be quickly engaging those processes. So that's different than performance support, where you're trying to prepare to face the guy you're going to face tonight. One of the advantages of the animated VR that you saw there is that it can take the TrackMan data that's produced in major league stadiums and most of the minor league stadiums as well, and you can actually model the actual pitches of that pitcher you're going to face tonight. That becomes a performance support sort of thing. Which one do you want to do? The people, everybody's drawn to that other one, but is that what you really want to do if your goal at that time with your athletes is development versus performance? So I've probably revealed myself here as a true Skinnerian black box behaviorist, and I'll raise the hand, that's true. there's a lot of magic that happens inside that black box between the eyes and the brain and hands. And we've got some speakers coming up who are really going to get into the feedback loop on that. But I'm like the farmer who doesn't really need to know how the seed grows. I want to know when to water and when to fertilize. The input, the output, and the feedback loop that makes whatever that magic is grow faster for more people. That's the goal of that. So, let's share this and really think about the extraordinary performance first of the pitchers. This is a Cy Young winner throwing 3 pitches out of that same window. And now, are there technologies, just, relatively modest technologies that we can put that can help a batter, not consciously, but, ultimately unconsciously recognize those early cues so that they can, do something about it. So, as I say, when we get back to real sports and real baseball, let's take a moment to appreciate those truly extraordinary performances on both sides of the ball. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining in here. And if you're a Twitter person, I'm Twitter only. That's the only one. But please check out Dr. Fatty or at Pitch Recognition. And that is my pitch. Thank you very much.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Peter, so much. So now we'll go back to some of the Q&A as well. We'll have a few minutes to answer a couple different questions. Reminder to upvote any that you also have. So Peter, I'm curious, just in thinking about creating some of the, you mentioned a lot of the distinction that can go into whether you're using animated or more realistic, but I'm curious, how do you create those scenarios from a technological perspective, either from the video or, basically how does one create those scenarios on the fly, and even for different settings, like whether it's military, more open skilled sports, that kind of thing?
Well, and that's a really key thing to decide and early on. Like in law enforcement, military, they have body cam. Are you going to try and use that body cam? Use the actual footage that has so much of the realism in it? Or are you going to animate it so you have more control? So it's kind of a realism versus control issue.
Yeah.
You've got complete control over something you've animated. That's one benefit. The other benefit is that it can be interactive. That person can act and the system acts back. On the other hand, when you're trying to train, unconscious parts of the brain to read and react in time frames, and I mean, we're talking about hitting baseballs, but think about use of force decision making in law enforcement. That's a lot at stake in a matter of under a second often. So, that's why it's so important and so valuable for the folks to be here and think about these things and try and understand what are the pluses and minuses of some of these tools and how does it fit my need, but also my opportunity, because the animation is higher front end. I can just go out and shoot some video, but now I've got to go out and shoot all my video. And, you're going to put more into the animation, the VR development, but then once you've got that engine, now you can generate an exhaustive amount of it.
That makes sense. Thank you. And then I'm also curious if there are any, whether it's like cognitive perspectives or things that would be maybe exclude this technology from being effective for someone, whether it's like cognitive impairment or like concussion, those kind of things. Well,
there's a certain amount of concern with that in the VR realm.
Yeah.
And that becomes a whole other issue. And we've had some things people have wondered, like with the occlusion goggles and things like that. Whoops. Sorry, time's up. With the occlusion goggles. And that's one of a benefit, like that video occlusion method that we were showing, the feedback that we get from people using that, oh, that's just real baseball. It's not, it's really a kind of do no harm. It might do good, it might, you don't know, but it's not getting inside the mechanism quite so much as those immersive technologies. Because with the immersive ones, now sometimes you've got mismatches. And it's kind of like the Disney people with their simulators really have to deal with simulator sickness. Because if you get a mismatch between the feedback you're getting, the haptic feedback you're getting from your body and what your eyes are telling you, somebody's filling a garbage can. So, like military you mentioned, when they do that type of training, they always make sure they've got an empty can nearby.
That makes sense. And anything you notice, and you might not, but that makes people maybe more or less likely to experience some of those symptoms?
No, that's kind of individual.
Yeah.
A lot of people's like, no problem. The one where we were looking at in hockey, now you've got the camera moving. Again, it has an effect on some people, not on others. And so not only is the practitioner choosing an approach based on what's appropriate for the learning goal, what their opportunities are to develop or acquire that, but also the learners, because they're going to have preferences too. And you're going to have some people that just can't take that environment. I don't know whether there's an advanced test for that or not. You probably try to be ready with a couple of approaches to see what works with them.
That makes sense. Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then I'm curious if, just in thinking about maybe some of the research and literature on using virtual reality, where are some of those gaps that you see or things that you would like to see science move forward in?
I think we're still terribly caught up with a lot of research that's just based on, how realistic can we make it? We haven't really, and this is my area of instructional design. I'm not blaming sports science for that. We haven't really investigated that question of how much and what kind of real do you need? How real does virtual reality really need to be? How is that not a question that the practitioner can go and find a nice matrix for? That's on us. We'll keep working on it.
That makes sense. Okay, and then I think we'll do one more question before going to our break. So could you talk to me just a little bit about some of the differences in training that you see using video occlusion between more closed skill sports, so like pitch recognition, and more open skill sports where you're more reactive to the environment?
Right. It really is designed for those closed skills. And that's a good terminology to use, because something like hitting a pitch, the pitcher's always in the same place. He's not going to go stand on second base. And even when they've done that research with something like soccer, they're more looking at something like penalty kicks, again, in that closed space. In the open space, there's research in that, not as much using the occlusion method, but I think that the same method can work there, because we've still got the same thing that we're getting at, which is anticipation. So when you talk to athletes, you talk to coaches, you talk to performance specialists, once somebody has the requisite physical skills, the difference a lot of times they recognize comes down to anticipation, and that's what we call in the field pre-existing pre-cues, before the action happens. In military, left of bang. What are you able to pick up there? And certainly with eye tracking, you can see some of those things. Are people looking at the defender that's right in front of them, or is that point guard actually, if we track that, but now people are moving in space, all of those things get challenges. Are they looking at that forward who's cutting over here and there might be an opening to pass to? So it's more challenging in that area. I think the same methods can apply. And I don't think we need point of view video. I think low over the shoulder video, like in football, they fly that spider cam back there and it looks right over the quarterback's shoulder looking out on the defenses. Wow, would I like to get a hold of that for training?